What you are about to hear will fundamentally change how you understand every peace negotiation, ceasefire proposal, and diplomatic initiative that has been announced in the past 75 years. While political leaders celebrate peace agreements as triumphs of diplomacy and the end of conflicts, the structural analysis reveals something far more disturbing. Peace deals in the modern era are not endpoints to competition. They are strategic maneuvers within continuous conflicts that never actually terminate. The peace deal that is being negotiated right now, the one that Western media presents as the conclusive resolution to years of bloodshed and the foundation for lasting stability, is not what it appears to be. It is a trap. Not a trap in the sense of deliberate deception by negotiators, though that certainly occurs. A trap in the structural sense, an arrangement that all parties enter believing it serves their interests while it actually perpetuates the exact conditions that guarantee future conflict. What I'm going to show you tonight is why the Cold War never ended, why every major peace agreement since 1945 has failed to produce actual peace, and why the current negotiations follow a pattern so consistent across conflicts and continents that recognizing the pattern allows you to predict outcomes with disturbing accuracy. 3 questions will drive everything that follows. First, what structural features of modern geopolitics make permanent peace impossible, regardless of diplomatic intentions or treaty language? Second, why do rational actors continue pursuing peace agreements that historical evidence shows will fail? And third, what does this pattern mean for the conflicts unfolding right now and the agreements being negotiated as solutions? There are no comfortable answers tonight, and what I am about to argue will be dismissed by many as cynical or defeatist. But structural analysis is not about optimism or pessimism. It is about understanding the forces that shape outcomes regardless of our preferences. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why peace deals perpetuate conflict, why the Cold War framework still governs great power competition, and why the next major war is not a question of if, but when and where. The fundamental argument is this: the Cold War never ended because the structural conditions that produced it, ideological competition between incompatible systems, nuclear weapons preventing direct great power conflict, and economic interdependence requiring continuous competition for resources and markets, remain unchanged. Okay? Extinção or incide. What ended in 1991 was not the Cold War, but merely one phase of it, specifically the Soviet Union's ability to compete symmetrically with the United States. The underlying contest for global dominance simply shifted forms. Let me explain exactly what I mean, because this claim contradicts the foundational narrative of the past 3 decades that has shaped Western policy, academic analysis, and popular understanding. The conventional narrative is straightforward. The Cold War was the ideological and geopolitical competition between the United States and Soviet Union from 1947 to 1991. The Soviet economic model failed, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, the USSR collapsed, and the Cold War ended with American victory. The post-Cold War era began, characterized by American unipolarity, democratic expansion, economic globalization, and the peace dividend from reduced military competition. This narrative is not completely false. These events genuinely occurred. But the narrative mistakes the collapse of one competitor for the end of competition itself. It assumes that because the Soviet Union failed, the structural dynamics driving great power competition disappeared. This assumption was always absurd, and 30 years of evidence have proven it catastrophically wrong. Here is the structural reality. Great powers compete for dominance because international systems contain no authority capable of enforcing rules or preventing aggression. This condition, which international relations scholars call anarchy, has characterized global politics for millennia and continues unchanged. The forms of competition vary: military conquest, economic rivalry, ideological struggle, technological races, but the underlying dynamic persists because the structural condition persists. Nuclear weapons transformed great power competition by making direct war between nuclear-armed states potentially suicidal, but they did not eliminate competition, they redirected it. Instead of fighting each other directly, great powers compete through proxies, economic warfare, cyber operations, space militarization, and influence campaigns. The Cold War was not an aberration caused by Soviet communism. The Cold War was the adaptation of eternal great power competition to the nuclear age. When the Soviet Union collapsed, American policymakers and academics convinced themselves that competition had ended because they conflated the failure of one competitor with the obsolescence of competition itself. This was the exact same mistake that British strategists made after defeating Napoleon, that Roman emperors made after destroying Carthage, that every dominant power throughout history has made after achieving temporary supremacy. The pattern is consistent. Dominant power defeats primary rival, declares permanent peace and end of history, reduces military preparedness while enjoying peace dividend, fails to notice emerging competitors until too late, faces catastrophic war against rivals it did not prepare to fight. This cycle has repeated for 3,000 years, and it is repeating right now. China understood this immediately. While American academics declared the end of history and American corporations pursued quarterly profits through Chinese manufacturing integration, Chinese strategists studied the collapse of the Soviet Union to understand how to avoid similar fate while pursuing the same objective: displacing American dominance. The lessons China drew were precise. First, do not compete symmetrically with the United States in military spending. The Soviet Union bankrupted itself trying to match American defense budgets. Second, integrate into the American-led economic system rather than building parallel structures. Autarky failed for the USSR, but interdependence creates leverage. Third, avoid ideological confrontation that unifies American domestic politics. Let the Americans fight among themselves. Fourth, extend the timeline. Accept temporary subordination while building capabilities for eventual competition. This strategy succeeded brilliantly because it exploited the American assumption that the Cold War had ended. American corporations transferred technology to China, believing they were creating markets and peaceful interdependence. American policymakers supported Chinese WTO accession, believing economic integration would produce political liberalization. American strategists accepted Chinese military modernization as natural development of a rising power within a stable international system. All of these assumptions rested on the foundational belief that great power competition had ended with the Cold War's conclusion. But China never accepted this premise. Chinese strategy documents from the 1990s explicitly describe a multipolar world, replacing American unipolarity and China's rise as a great power destined to restore its historical centrality. This was never hidden. Western analysts simply chose not to believe it because it contradicted the post-Cold War narrative. By 2015, the evidence of continued competition became undeniable. China had built the world's largest navy by hull count, established military bases across the Indo-Pacific and Africa, initiated the Belt and Road Initiative, creating dependencies across 65 countries, and begun asserting territorial claims that challenged American guaranteed regional order. Russia had rebuilt military capability, annexed Crimea, intervened in Syria, and demonstrated willingness to use force despite Western opposition. The American response was confused because the intellectual framework assumed competition had ended. How do you respond to competitors when your entire strategic culture insists competition is obsolete? The result was half measures, sanctions that inconvenienced but did not deter, and rhetorical condemnations substituting for strategic responses. This brings us to peace deals and why they function as traps rather than solutions. Let me take you inside the structural logic that makes peace agreements inherently unstable in the current international system. A genuine peace agreement requires several conditions. First, all parties must prefer the peace settlement to continued conflict. Second, the settlement must be enforceable, either through mutual agreement or external enforcement. Third, the settlement must address the underlying causes of conflict rather than merely pausing hostilities. Fourth, no party can believe it will gain advantage by violating the agreement. These conditions are extraordinarily difficult to satisfy simultaneously, and in the nuclear age with great power competition, they are functionally impossible. Let me show you why. Consider the Ukraine conflict and the peace negotiations that have been proposed repeatedly since February 2022. Every proposal involves some version of ceasefire, territorial settlement, security guarantees, and normalization of relations. Western media presents these proposals as potential solutions that could end the bloodshed if only Putin would accept reasonable terms. But analyze the structural incentives. Russia invaded Ukraine because it perceived Ukrainian integration into Western institutions as existential threat to Russian security and domestic regime stability. A peace deal that left Ukraine armed, supported by the West, and oriented toward Euro-Atlantic integration would not address the Russian perception of threat. It would simply pause Russian efforts to eliminate that threat until conditions favored renewed action. Ukraine accepts peace negotiations because continued war imposes enormous costs in casualties, economic destruction, and societal trauma. But Ukraine's fundamental objective, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and Western integration cannot be secured through negotiated settlement with Russia because Russia's fundamental objective is preventing exactly that outcome. The objectives are mutually exclusive. The United States and European nations support peace negotiations because prolonged war risks escalation, strains military budgets, and creates domestic political costs. But the Western objective, preventing Russian expansion and maintaining credible deterrence, requires demonstrating that aggression produces costs exceeding benefits. A negotiated settlement that allowed Russia to retain conquered territory would undermine deterrence by proving that nuclear powers can revise borders through force. Every party enters negotiations with incompatible objectives. Any agreement they reach will therefore be a temporary compromise that no party views as final resolution. Both sides will use the peace period to rearm, build alliances, and prepare for resumed conflict under better conditions. The peace deal is not peace, it is an armistice within ongoing war. This pattern is not unique to Ukraine. Let me show you the historical precedent, because what I am describing has happened repeatedly for a century, and recognizing the pattern reveals why current negotiations will fail regardless of diplomatic skill or leadership intentions. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 ended World War I and was celebrated as the foundation for permanent peace through the League of Nations. The structural analysis reveals why it guaranteed World War II. Germany was defeated but not destroyed, humiliated but not reconciled, weakened but not incapable of recovery. The treaty imposed costs that generated German resentment while leaving Germany capable of future military resurgence. France and Britain believed the treaty secured peace. Germany viewed it as temporary injustice to be reversed when circumstances permitted. Within 20 years, Germany had rearmed, remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and invaded Poland. The Treaty of Versailles did not prevent World War II. It created the conditions that made World War II inevitable by establishing peace terms that the defeated power would inevitably seek to overturn. The Korean Armistice of 1953 ended active combat in the Korean War and established the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. 70 years later, the war has never formally ended. Both sides maintain massive military forces along the border, and periodic crises threaten resumed conflict. The armistice did not resolve the underlying conflict between incompatible systems and territorial claims. It froze the conflict at the point of military exhaustion. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 ended American involvement in the Vietnam War through negotiated settlement that was supposed to allow South Vietnam to survive, with American support short of direct military intervention. Within 2 years, North Vietnam had conquered South Vietnam entirely. The peace agreement was not a genuine settlement. It was American domestic political cover for abandoning an ally while pretending negotiation had achieved honorable outcome. The Dayton Accords of 1995 ended the Bosnian War by partitioning Bosnia into ethnic entities with international peacekeeping preventing renewed conflict. 28 years later, Bosnia remains divided, international troops remain deployed, and political leaders still mobilize ethnic grievances using the same rhetoric that produced the war. The conflict was frozen, not resolved. The pattern repeats because the structural conditions remain constant. Peace agreements in multipolar systems with great power competition do not resolve conflicts. They pause conflicts until one side believes conditions favor renewed action. The pause might last months, years, or decades, but absent fundamental change in relative power, interests, or systemic structure, the conflict remains latent. Now, let me show you why rational actors continue pursuing agreements they know will fail, because this paradox reveals something crucial about how states actually behave versus how diplomatic rhetoric describes their behavior. States pursue peace agreements even when structural analysis shows they will fail because the agreements serve immediate interests regardless of long-term sustainability. Political leaders face domestic pressure to end costly wars, so agreements that reduce casualties and spending provide political benefit even if they guarantee future conflict. Military forces need time to reconstitute after exhausting campaigns, so ceasefires allow rebuilding regardless of whether they lead to lasting peace. Economic interests prefer stable conditions for trade and investment, so agreements that normalize relations benefit business constituencies even temporarily. The peace agreement serves each party's immediate tactical interests while failing to address strategic competition. Everyone understands this, but no one can afford to say it publicly because populations demand the fiction of peace even when elites recognize that competition continues. This creates a situation where diplomatic negotiations proceed according to public scripts about peace and reconciliation, while actual policy is designed for continued competition. Western leaders negotiate with Russia while increasing defense budgets and expanding NATO. Russia negotiates while rebuilding military forces and deepening partnerships with China and Iran. Both sides use negotiations to buy time and improve positions for the next phase of conflict. The sophistication of modern statecraft lies in maintaining this dual reality: public commitment to peace combined with practical preparation for war. Leaders who acknowledge this openly face domestic backlash for defeatism or warmongering. Leaders who genuinely believe their own rhetoric about lasting peace are quickly disappointed by adversaries who never shared that belief. This brings us to the current geopolitical landscape and why the Cold War framework explains contemporary dynamics far better than post-Cold War theories about democratic peace, economic interdependence, or rules-based international order. The United States and China are engaged in comprehensive competition across every domain: military positioning in the Indo-Pacific, technological race for artificial intelligence and semiconductor dominance, economic warfare through tariffs and investment restrictions, ideological struggle between democratic and authoritarian models, and space militarization. This is not economic rivalry or regional dispute. It is systemic competition for global dominance identical in structure to the US-Soviet Cold War. The differences from the original Cold War are tactical, not strategic. China integrated into the global economy rather than building autarkic systems, so the competition includes economic interdependence that the US-Soviet rivalry lacked. China avoided direct ideological confrontation, so the competition operates without the mobilizing rhetoric of capitalism versus communism. China extended the timeline, so the competition proceeds more slowly than the rapid Cold War escalations. But the fundamental dynamic is unchanged. Two great powers with incompatible visions of global order, nuclear weapons preventing direct war, and competition proceeding through proxies, economics, technology, and influence. The Cold War never ended, it evolved. Russia's role in this system is particularly instructive. After the Soviet collapse, Western policymakers believed Russia would integrate into the Western-led order as junior partner, accepting American dominance. This assumption was always delusional because it ignored Russian strategic culture, historical memory, and elite interests. Russia, under Putin, rebuilt military capability, reasserted regional dominance in former Soviet space, and positioned itself as spoiler power capable of disrupting American initiatives globally. Russia cannot compete with the United States symmetrically, but it does not need to. Russia simply needs to create enough problems in enough locations that American attention and resources are divided. The Syria intervention demonstrates this perfectly. Russia committed limited forces to support Assad, preventing regime collapse and securing Russian military bases, while the United States spent years and billions of dollars on failed regime change efforts. Russia achieved strategic objectives at minimal cost while imposing massive costs on the United States. This is asymmetric competition that exploits American overextension. The current peace negotiations over Ukraine fit precisely into this pattern. Russia is not negotiating for permanent peace. Russia is negotiating to consolidate gains, rebuild forces, and prepare for the next phase of competition. The United States is not negotiating for permanent peace. The United States is negotiating to reduce immediate costs while maintaining long-term containment of Russian power. Ukraine is negotiating for survival while knowing that any agreement depends on Western commitment that might evaporate. Everyone understands that the peace deal, if reached, will be temporary. Everyone understands that both sides will use the peace period to prepare for resumed conflict. And everyone understands that the underlying competition, Russian assertion of regional dominance versus American commitment to European security architecture, remains unresolved. So why pursue the agreement? Because the alternative is admitting publicly that the war will continue indefinitely, which no political leader can afford domestically. The peace deal is theater for domestic audiences while actual policy continues preparing for renewed conflict. Let me now show you the specific mechanisms through which peace agreements perpetuate conflict rather than resolving it, because understanding these mechanisms is essential for predicting how current negotiations will fail. First mechanism, territorial settlements that satisfy neither party. Peace agreements typically involve territorial compromises where neither side gets everything it wants. These compromises are presented as pragmatic solutions, but they guarantee future conflict because both sides view the settlement as temporary injustice to be corrected when power balances shift. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict exemplifies this perfectly. Every peace proposal involves some territorial partition that neither Israelis nor Palestinians accept as final or just. Israeli settlements continue expanding regardless of peace agreements. Palestinian factions reject any settlement that does not include full return to 1967 borders. No agreement can satisfy both positions simultaneously, so every agreement either fails immediately or produces temporary quiet before renewed conflict. Second mechanism, security guarantees that cannot be enforced. Peace agreements often include security guarantees where external powers promise to protect settlement terms. But these guarantees are only credible if the guarantor is willing to fight to enforce them, which is rarely true. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994 guaranteed Ukrainian territorial integrity in exchange for nuclear weapons surrender. Russia violated this guarantee by annexing Crimea and invading eastern Ukraine. The United States and United Kingdom, co-guarantors, provided sanctions and weapons, but not direct military intervention. The guarantee proved worthless because the guarantors were unwilling to fight Russia over Ukrainian territory. This pattern repeats constantly. Security guarantees work only when potential violators believe enforcement is certain. If enforcement is uncertain, the guarantee fails to deter violation. But making enforcement certain requires military commitments that guarantors are rarely willing to provide. So guarantees remain intentionally ambiguous, which guarantees their eventual violation. Third mechanism, economic interdependence that creates leverage rather than peace. The theory of democratic peace argues that economic interdependence makes war irrational because trade benefits exceed war gains. This theory ignores that interdependence creates leverage that can be weaponized during competition. Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas was supposed to create mutual interest preventing conflict. Instead, it created leverage that Russia used to divide European responses to Ukrainian invasion. Germany's initial reluctance to support sanctions reflected fear of economic consequences from energy cutoff. Russia calculated correctly that interdependence would constrain Western responses rather than preventing Russian aggression. Similarly, American-Chinese economic interdependence has not prevented comprehensive competition. It has simply changed the forms of competition to include tariff wars, investment restrictions, technology transfer controls, and supply chain decoupling. The interdependence that was supposed to guarantee peace instead became a vulnerability that both sides now recognize and attempt to reduce, or dines. Fourth mechanism, domestic political incentives that reward conflict resumption. Peace agreements often strengthen hardline factions within each party who view the settlement as betrayal and mobilize opposition. Over time, these factions gain power by exploiting grievances created by the settlement, eventually controlling policy and resuming conflict. Northern Ireland's peace process illustrates this dynamic. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 ended decades of violence through power sharing and constitutional compromises. But political competition within Northern Ireland increasingly rewards parties that take maximalist positions, Irish unity versus British sovereignty, rather than centrist parties that built the peace. The agreement holds for now, but the political forces it created undermine the compromise it established. Fifth mechanism, military modernization during peace that prepares for future war. Peace periods allow military forces to recover from combat exhaustion, integrate lessons learned, develop new capabilities, and rebuild inventories. Both sides use peace to prepare for renewed conflict under better conditions, which makes renewed conflict more likely rather than less. The interwar period between World War I and World War II demonstrates this perfectly. The Washington Naval Treaty and other disarmament agreements were supposed to prevent renewed arms racing. Instead, all major powers used the period to develop new military technologies, including aircraft carriers, strategic bombers, tanks, and eventually nuclear weapons. The peace period was actually preparation period for more devastating conflict. Current dynamics follow identical pattern. China used the past 30 years of nominal peace to build the world's largest navy, develop hypersonic missiles, establish global military bases, and create integrated air defense systems. The United States used the same period to develop stealth aircraft, precision-guided weapons, cyber capabilities, and space-based intelligence systems. Both sides prepared for future conflict during peace, making that conflict increasingly likely. Now, let me address the scenarios, because understanding how this pattern unfolds allows prediction of outcomes that will surprise those operating within the peace deal mythology. Scenario 1, in tribes. The peace agreement is signed with great fanfare. Political leaders claim historic achievement, and both sides immediately begin violating the terms covertly while maintaining public commitment. This is the most likely scenario because it serves all parties' immediate interests. For Russia, peace agreement provides legitimacy for territorial gains, removes economic sanctions, allows military reconstitution, and divides Western alliance as European nations prioritize economic normalization while Eastern Europeans demand continued pressure. Russia uses the peace period to rebuild forces, deepen partnerships with China and Iran, and prepare for eventual move to consolidate control over Ukraine entirely. For Ukraine, peace agreement provides immediate relief from combat casualties and economic destruction, secures Western economic aid for reconstruction, and allows military rebuilding with Western weapons and training. Ukraine uses the peace period to build defensive capabilities that make future Russian invasion prohibitively costly. For the United States and Europe, peace agreement reduces immediate defense spending, allows pivot back to China competition, and provides political win for leaders who can claim they ended the war. Western powers use the peace period to build European defense capabilities that reduce American burden while maintaining containment architecture. All three parties understand that peace is temporary. All three use the peace period to prepare for resumed conflict. The agreement collapses when one side believes conditions favor renewed action, probably within 5 to 10 years as demographic, economic, or political factors shift the balance. Scenario 2. Negotiations fail to produce agreement and the war continues at varying intensity for years or decades, eventually freezing into armistice line similar to Korea. This scenario is also highly likely because the parties' fundamental objectives remain incompatible. In this scenario, combat continues with varying intensity depending on seasonal factors, supply availability, and political pressures. Neither side achieves decisive victory because nuclear weapons prevent total war while military balance prevents breakthrough. Eventually, exhaustion produces informal ceasefire along established lines, with both sides maintaining forces and claiming the territory they control.